discussion. So we'll jump right into it if that's okay with all the panelists. Should we begin?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Good evening. Very good evening to all, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Executive Director of ICC India, and I'm delighted to welcome you all at our webinar, Understanding ICC Digital Standards Initiative, popularly known as the DSI. Let me begin by thanking Mr. Oswald Kuyler, Managing Director, DSI, for accepting our request to address our members and the wider banking, finance, trade, and industry community today. He will be joined by Mr. Pinaki Roy, a trade, finance, and banking industry veteran and a member of the ICC India Banking and Finance Working Group. Thank you, Mr. Roy, for taking up the role of interviewer today. I'm also delighted to share that we are joined by someone who has always been very supportive of our efforts and is also very progressive when it comes to technology. Welcome and thank you, Mr. C.V. Nageswar, for joining us. I would also like to thank all the participants who have joined us in this webinar on a weekday today. Now, something about ICC India. Now, ICC India, in its endeavor to facilitate international trade, has always supported industry through its focus programs and interventions. Some of these include seminars, workshops, conferences, policy guidelines, and papers and webinars over the last 1 year especially. Today's webinar is one such attempt to understand in detail one of the most promising initiatives of the ICC in recent times, the DSI. Digitalization has accelerated over the last few years, with platforms recording more users and the volume of digital transactions also rising. With COVID-19, the need for digitalization has further moved up in priority list of banks, businesses, regulatory authorities, and consumers also. So is the case with digitalization of trade. Nowadays, it seems that everyone is doing something on trade digitalization, but there isn't any standardization or uniformity. ICC launched the DSI, a collaborative cross-industry effort to enable the standardization of digital trade to meet this challenge. The ICC DSI will build on work done by various like-minded initiatives, many of which aim to digitize trade, notably through the development of open trade and technology standards to promote interoperability. You will hear more on this in detail from Oswald today. As far as India is concerned, it would be reasonable to say that over the last couple of years, we have made steady progress towards digital economy and so also trade digitalization, although not at a desirable pace. On the trade side, and I don't want to bore my already very informed participant, but it's always good to get a bit of a flavor. There have been multiple initiatives in India, like the Export Data Processing and Monitoring System, or the EDPMS, the Import Data Processing and Monitoring System, the IDPMS, for effective monitoring and efficient processing of all export-import transactions. The IceGate to provide e-filing services to the trade, cargo carriers, and other trading partners electronically. Pilot project on e-stamp duty, which could be implemented very soon across India, making entire stamp duty process digital. Digital documents execution, or DDE, for paperless execution and storage of financial contracts. Plans to accommodate e-bill of lading, centralized KYC, and many others. But all these efforts have remained limited and disjointed, and that too by only a handful of financial institutions and big corporates in silos. It is important to involve the last partner in the chain, be it MSME or a small cooperative bank. Keeping India's economic diversity in mind, I feel that it would be an unproductive exercise if we keep these players out of the digitalization process, even if it is unintended. According to one study by McKinsey, digital intervention that result in higher system efficiency and better asset utilization can reduce logistic costs by 15 to 25%. Another study by Citi cites that with the aid of digitization, a 10% improvement in efficiencies could yield approximately $5 billion of saving over logistic costs in every year. Whatever be the assessment, the point is it's the right direction. But for India to reap the full benefits of digitization and minimize the pain of transitioning to a digital economy, business leaders, banks, government officials, and institutions like the ICC will need to play distinct roles while also working together. I hope that today's discussion leave us better informed to enable and support us the trade digitization process locally at various levels. Now I would like to invite Mr. Nageswar, Deputy Managing Director, State Bank of India, to kindly deliver his inaugural address. Mr. Nageswar.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Imran Khan. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this all-important webinar on ICC Digital Standards Initiative. Mr. Oswald, Mr. Pinaki Roy, and all the participants of this important webinar, good evening to all of you. I know the world has entered into 2021 with a hope for the future, with vaccination starting and segments of economies showing resilience. There are good prospects of economic recovery for this year onwards. While the pandemic has created something which is very, very disastrous, and we never knew how 2020 has passed, but there are certain positive things that have happened. One of the important positive things is moving towards digitalization. The accelerated movement towards digitalization is something that has happened. In fact, for the benefit of Mr. Oswald, State Bank of India has got 425 million customers. And for me to handle such a large volume of transactions, it would be just impossible. But 91% of my transactions happen through alternate channels, that is a digital world. And that's how we are in a position to handle such large volumes. So this more and more is moving towards digitalization. And in trade finance, which is extremely important for us to move towards that. Today, banks are facing higher costs of labor intensive paper based processes. There are higher due diligence costs. In fact, we are present across the globe in 32 countries. And in those countries where trade finance is there, it's the due diligence cost is extremely expensive. And because of the stricter compliance and regulatory requirements and the pressures to shorten the process, everywhere, wherever we talk to our corporates, they say that the turnaround time has to come down. And you need to have a simplified risk mitigation measures. I know Imran did speak about McKinsey, he did speak about KPMG. Let me just talk about BCG estimates. The BCG had, in fact, said that there would be around 20 to 37% of the globe of the cost savings if you move towards digitalization. And it works out to, I mean, a small, better figure, Mr. Imran, it says 12 to $16 billion would be the savings. And in fact, one of the important things that State Bank has done was we moved to a digital platform. We called one particular app that we started off, what we call as YONO. It's a one platform where we can do all retail transactions, everything. And that's the reason why we call it as you know you only need one. We switched over from retail customers to the corporates also. And trade finance, trade business is also migrated to it. The people would be in a position to upload the import documents, take the prices. But so much we can do. There are lot many others that can be digitalized. This SBI is moving out of the even LC back business. We're moving into structured supply chain finance. We are also trying to interact with FDI, FIMDA, government, regulatory, RBI, ICC on a constant basis. We together with ICC, together with Mr. Imran, we had conducted various seminars. Of course, it used to be physical movement across the country, and we used to conduct the seminars. Unfortunately, for the last 1 year, we're doing it through webinar only. But then it's good that we are interacting and talking to everyone. But as Mr. Imran had very rightly brought out, the most important part for the digitalization, which, as I said, which is going to save so much of money, is one, we have challenges on standardized documents. There is no standard documents in India. There is some digitalization did happen, but those digital documents do not find acceptance everywhere. There is interoperability issues. There are issues with various legal, regulatory challenges. The whole gamut of issues are there. But one thing that is there, which I can assure you and talk to you, Mr. Oswald, in India, the other day also I had an interaction because we constantly interact with the regulators and the ministers and the government. The other day we had an interaction, we had a meeting with Singapore, and where the Commerce Minister, Mr. Imran, Mr. Piyush Goyal, and the Commerce Trade Minister of Singapore participated, where I also was there. The important part is every one of us, the regulators, the government, the bankers, the customers, the all stakeholders, and above all ICC with all the initiatives, we are all committed to moving towards this digitalization. And I'm sure with your commitment and with your DSI, which with these type of webinars, it's help us in accelerating to move towards the digitalization. So I'll stop here, and I would like to hear from you, Mr. Oswald, for giving us the necessary direction and take the things forward. Thank you. Stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you very much, sir, and thank you for reinforcing the necessity for all the stakeholders to come in the same room and start talking to each other and not be in the respective. And when somebody like you, and especially from State Bank of India, says that, I'm sure other bankers will listen to. Thank you very much. Now, before I hand over the proceedings to our next speaker, I would also say that keeping the interest of the participants in mind, we will have roughly around 25-30 minutes of Q&A post discussion. And please feel free to post your questions during the course of the discussion, and we'll try to pose as many as possible to our guest speaker, Oswald, today. And with these words, and without making everybody wait, I will hand over the proceeding to Mr. Pinaki Roy. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Imran. Thanks, Mr. Venkat. Wonderful listening to you. Thanks for giving me the honor of anchoring Mr. Oswald Kuyler today, because, like all of the participants or all the delegates have been waiting with bated breath for listening to Oswald, which is, like this is the first time, I believe, since his joining ICC in September 2020, this will be the first time he'll be interacting with the Indian audience in particular. ICC is an organization which was founded some 100 years ago by certain people calling themselves merchant of peace. And their credibility has been so high that anything related to trade finance or anything related to international commercial terms, it's always the question is, what is the ICC opinion? So with that kind of credibility, Mr. Oswald would be addressing the audience today. Let me tell you, Mr. Oswald, there was a standard story behind Reuters. Good old days, Reuters salespeople used to tell us that when Hitler came to know that Berlin had fallen, he apparently asked people that whether it has come on Reuters. So as far as trade finance, documentary credit, digital transactions, all these issues are concerned, your status is as good as what Reuters used to have in the good old days. So, Mr. Oswald, my first question is for the benefit of the audience, if you could tell us what is the scope of digital standard initiative, what is this global phenomenon, and in particular with reference to the digital roadmap which ICC is having. Over to me, Mr. Oswald. I'll be only giving you a cue. The stage is yours, the microphone is yours, and the entire audience is also yours. Thank you, Mr. Imran.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the kind introductions. I really appreciate it. I first want to start off by just saying it's an absolute honor to talk with all of you today. A country and an industry as rich, diverse, and large as India is definitely a place where I believe it's not just myself giving you insight into what the DSI is doing, but I'm pretty sure with Imran, ICC, and all the stakeholders in India, there's a lot that we're going to learn from each other, and we can work together going forward. So to answer the question on the DSI and what is it that the DSI is doing, the simplest way to address that is to think a bit about what ICC's objective is at a core. Our biggest goal is to help businesses do better. And what better place to participate and to really help businesses today in 2021 than to actually help with the digitization of trade. If you look at what happened last year in 2020, we've had a pandemic hit us, we've seen a lot of fraud cases, and a lot of companies, not just the banks, but a lot of the importers and exporters started realizing that a lot of these business cases that they used to have for trade digitization that was theoretical. Yeah, it's going to reduce risk, etc., etc. A lot of those became true. And it was easy to start measuring the impact of physical documentation in the supply chain. More recently, you saw some fraud cases, especially in the region that I'm in, that's also impacted people when it comes to, the trade digitization space. And so there's been this realization that, there's no such time like the present. And so how do we approach this, and how do we approach digitization differently? How do we help all of the companies on earth to transition off paper into the digital landscape? And we all know, I'm probably talking to an audience that will agree with me, saying not only does this help when it comes to business resilience, not only will this help when it comes to making sure our companies become more effective and efficient, but it's also going to start helping us with a lot of these use cases we have around fraud. And finally, and this is where the MSMEs come in a big way, it's going to help us to reduce the complexity for them, give them access to new innovative business models, and help them further participate in the financial space. So the DSI was born in concept when we launched the digital roadmap at the ICC. And for those of you who haven't seen the digital roadmap, it had a recognition that there's not just one problem we need to solve, there's actually quite a few problems we need to solve, and they are all equally complex. One of them is regulation and making sure that both importing and exporting nations have legislation and laws that enable electronic transferable records internationally. And another element that was highlighted was the fact that we actually needed standards. We needed to ensure that we're all speaking the same language, whether we were referring to companies or goods or bills of lading, etc., so that as we move into this digital landscape, we didn't end up having this very complex environment where everyone's calling something something else and we can't scale. And finally, so once we developed this digital roadmap and we published it and we showed the world, these are the key, here's a few elements that we need to solve for. A lot of the technology platform owners also came to the realization that this is not a problem that one company will solve. This is not one company is going to win and the whole world's trade is just going to be executed on one platform, but rather that we needed to bridge all of these different digital silos. And so the DSI was born out of a lot of those platform owners coming together saying, well, help ICC. You're the only organization that is truly cross-regional. You're not there just for one specific country or one specific region, but you're orientated towards the whole globe. And two, you're not there for just one specific industry. So it's not just that you're looking after, let's say, shippers or banks or agri. You actually have quite a diverse customer base. And this is why we stepped in. We knew we were neutral. We knew we had the scope and the breadth across all of that. And when you think about our DNA, Incoterms, EUCP, etc., it's in our DNA to also help create clarity where clarity is needed. And so that's the ICC, that's the DSI, and that's how we were born out of the origins of the digital roadmap. And so my KPI, or my key performance indicator, if you will, and I like what the previous speakers were talking about, how do we accelerate this journey? And one of the key things that I've done is I've made sure my performance and the performance of the initiative isn't measured based on the amount of standards we produce, but it's measured based on, are we impacting, for example, the issuance of electronic bills of lading globally, which the DSA more recently stated as 0.1% globally for last year. Are we accelerating the adoption? Are we shortening that time frame? When you look at one of the studies we did last year as the ICC, a lot of banks viewed that, yes, digitization will happen, but it will take us at least another decade to get there. So how do we accelerate that? And so that's my key objective. How do we accelerate the adoption of digital? How do we get to a point where it's truly democratized? And how do we help, especially the MSME community, to transition off paper, get into an electronic world and reap all the benefits that come from that?
Well, Oswald, it's wonderful knowing about your plans. Since you have referred to, the benefits of ICC initiatives percolating to the lowest level, if I may say, I'm not casting aspersions on anyone, but there are cases where the ICC have not gone, like the glossary which they had for the supply chain finance. So the idea was that it should be used by everyone. But what has happened was the actual users never had a chance to see all those lovely stuff which you have done or the ICC have done. And since you have referred to also UCP, Oswald, you must have noted that this is the first time when the Uniform Customs and Practice has not been revised, but we have a version 2 of EUCP. So, Mr. Oswald, you know the importance you have in the world of digitization and the trade today. Instead of revision of UCP, this is unique. I mean, since 1933, every decade we had a new version of UCP. This is the first time there is no new UCP. You only have a second version of UCP, EURC, because the wise people sitting at the ICC corporate office or people like you must have realized that this is like as they say, when the idea comes, like you can't stop it. So it's an idea which has come today. And my favorite like movie, I always quote from there. There is a movie called 36 Chamber of Shaolin, where there is no 36 chamber. The protagonist took it to the masses. So, sir, if there are 35 elite chambers, Oswald will urge you to make it a 36 chamber, where all the ordinary guys like us, the trade practitioners, can get a chance to participate. I'll ask you about uniform rules for digital trade transactions a little later. I would like to have your thoughts on how do you think it will percolate to the actual users and trade practitioners in I wouldn't call them third world countries. It's not valid. But
Yeah.
you sitting in Singapore, which has a population of around 6 billion, I sit in a country where the population is close to 1.35 billion. So, like it's kind of a conglomerate of many cultures, diversities. So, what do you think would be, equally applicable to Singapore and a worst country like India, where, or maybe the South Asian countries like Bangladesh, which I understand is doing very well. I saw your appreciation for a program of Bangladesh and LinkedIn. So also, I'm taking your time. This is the privilege to talk to people like you. I don't get a chance to talk to guys like you every day. So pardon me if I'm a little verbose, but please allow me to ask my questions. And also, over to you again. It's it's wonderful listening to you. Please go ahead.
So I'm going to try and answer that, and if I don't, tell me, Oz, you have not answered the question. Okay, I'll leave that in in your hands. So I think there's a few things to unpack there that I think is very important to unpack. We've tried to solve digitization now for over 20, 30 years, right? And my view is that if I was going to be successful in this role, I have to approach it differently. I can't just try to do it the exact same way. All the previous, the previous initiatives or the platforms, etc. And so one of the key things we've done from the get-go, and if you think about the last 5 months, the first thing that we actually did through that process was recognize that even though ICC is the world's largest business organization and that we are represented in over 100 different countries, we still need to partner with even more people on this trade digitization journey. So the first thing I would almost highlight, that one of the first things we did was we said, how do we actually, as an example, pull the shipping community in? How do we ensure that we're not just solving trade digitization and only speaking to a specific industry or a specific market? And so the first thing you'll see is we've actually opened up to have quite a collaborative approach where we started bringing in organizations like BIMCO, which is the world's largest shipping alliance, organizations like FIATA, organizations closely like SWIFT, and the list goes on. I was giving my board presentation 2 days ago, and they said it looks like I'm collecting acronyms because there's almost 12 different acronyms there. The reason that's important is because I don't see trade digitization being solved by one organization producing all of the standards and all of the rules, and everyone else follows that. And so the approach that we've started to take is to actually say, well, for example, if we look at the bill of lading standard that everyone needs, is that something where the ICC needs to jump in and produce a brand new bill of lading standard for electronic? Or do we work closely together with, for example, the DCSA, BIMCO, etc., to see how do we work with them to solve it and leverage our strength as an advocate for adoption? I find a lot of great standards out there, but no one's truly adopting the standards. And so it's using our strength and finding great partners that's already working with multiple different industries over multiple different regions and saying, how do we collectively work together? The second thing I'll say is, and I'm going to use a practical example. Let's use the title transfer. So when you think about some of the platforms out there, a lot of them have terms and conditions or rule books that you sign up to that deals with how do you register a document of title, how do you transfer possession of that document of title. And so one of the first things we've done in that space is to say, instead of us jumping in and creating a solution, and then publishing it and saying, here's the solution for that, is actually to take a step back and actually ask the shippers, ask the miners, ask the smelters, etc. Well, what is actually the problem? What are we actually trying to solve for? What are the definitions that you actually want to have defined? And what is the level of liabilities that you actually want to do? And so one of the things that you'll see us do there is, instead of directly going to the technology companies, we actually went to the businesses. We said, how do we help you? Now, once we have that scope, it's then making sure, again, we have that collective approach and bring in all the right people. Now, when I look at Singapore and when I look at India, and when I even look at my home country of South Africa, right? The way in which I look at it is, India is one of the most diverse, one of the largest countries on earth, and there's a lot of innovations that's already happened in India that a lot of us can actually find inspiration on. I'll give you an example. I was talking just this morning again with Swift, and and yesterday I was talking to a few companies in Europe, and we were talking about, for example, invoicing, and India keeps on coming up as a good example of where someone has actually, practically have approached that challenge and at least try to start solving for it in a very real way. So again, it's more about looking what have the countries done well and how can we actually leverage that and how do we ensure we engage the business community. Now, because we're large, sometimes we're a little bit slower. And so because you want to take a collective approach, you'll see these are not things that we do in 2 or 3 months. But what I do like, and this is with leadership from ICC India as an example, is being able to directly engage through ICC India with the local community. And before we even start creating solutions, making sure that we actually have all the capabilities on earth from the various different countries looking at it and saying, this is not going to work, or yes, this will work based on our own experiences in digitizing, the various different business use cases. So I think in summary, what I'll like to summarize all of that is, the only way the DSI is successful is if it's inclusive. The only way the DSI is successful is if it's a cross-region, cross-industry approach. And the only way that I do this, and I don't spend 20 years writing brand new standards, is by finding areas that either countries or alliances have done really good work, picking that up and elevating that so that other countries and other industries can see that and actually adopt it and share, because that's what a standard is. A standard's all about what does good look like. How do we find that, uplift it, and share it between each other? I hope that's not too fluffy. If it is, you need to call me out.
Oswald, I must say the task is very daunting. all these days, I make a very candid confession that, as a former banker or, working for corporates in the trade desk, we always hid behind the argument that we deal in documents, not in goods. So, the areas you are going to cover for the bankers, we never bothered. So, UCP always protected the banks, if I may say so. But, the areas where you are working, as you rightly pointed out, it's inclusive. You are talking about the miners, the bill of lading or the electronic bill of lading has been going around for quite some time. I would also, make a reference to uniform rules for digital transactions. What is, being discussed? I think the draft 5 is already there, and by 2022, I presume that I don't know whether I'm a little ambitious, but I expect that it will come. Now, what will be the rules position vis-a-vis all the existing rules like UCP? There are many curious guys who would like to know about whether like the a letter of credit will remain the a letter of credit the way we know it today. I mean, like the story goes back, that during the times of crusade when Knight Templars were using letters of credit for the guys who participated in crusade. So from those days, LC has undergone many radical changes, and you also know that certain companies like Bolero and ESS Docs have been, like encouraging presentation under EUCP, or what they call in colloquial terms electronic LC. Now with URDTT, where they talk about payment obligation issued by the buyer, and you also have a financial service provider giving an undertaking, which is almost on par with an irrevocable undertaking given by the bank under LC or a standby letter of credit. So do you see the entire world get radically changed or absorbing the shock? Or you think that, like that famous popular quote where we have to unlearn and relearn? Is there a lot of relearning for guys like us? I'm not talking about the very tech savvy youngsters who I believe would press a few buttons on the software program and get acquainted to the new system. I'm talking about people who have been around for many years and who are mildly technologically challenged, but very well aware of how transactions actually happen in the so-called physical world, as like you the new generation would like to describe it as. What are your thoughts on the changes which might be brought in by the rules under Uniform Rules for Digital Trade Transactions?
So just to take a step back, so I'm the managing director of the Digital Standards Initiative, and we run next to the Banking Commission. So we're in close partnership with that team, and we work really hand on hand to ensure that we don't end up producing the same product within the DSI as to what is being produced, for example, by URDTT for payment obligations. And so if you have a look at what the DSI is doing, and maybe what I'll do is I'll spend 5 minutes just to give you an overview of exactly what our focus is and what we're solving for, and the change management element that you've just highlighted. So the first thing we've done is we actually went and we spoke to over 100 different importers, exporters, shippers, etc. And we said, we see in the news all of these successes that we're embracing digitization, trade is now becoming digital, and we see all the, the blockchain hype, which is really good, right? And so I sat with them and I said, well, how's it really going? Can you execute trade? Can you start a trade process in one system, and can you settle it in another? Because fundamentally, when you think about these business networks, they're quite complex. You have buyers and sellers and banks and ships, and unless they are all on the same platform, it's very difficult to exchange information, especially documents of title, between these parties. And so when it comes to the actual adoption of documents of title, like bills of lading, warehouse receipts, etc., the numbers aren't 10, 20, 30% adoption rates globally. Again, I bring it back to the stat we saw from DCSA, 0.1%. I spoke to a few large retailers who have not even started their digitization journey, because their view is, if the miners can't even digitize trade, and they use bulk ships and it's a lot less complex. How on earth do we do it when you think about us having 40,000 garment manufacturers? Like how do we even start to approach that? We can't tell all of everyone on our supply chain to sign up to one system. Not going to work. So what we've done is we've looked at that problem and we've said, in addition to all the great work that the Banking Commission is doing, what is missing? What is not there? And what do we need to fill as the Digital Standards Initiative? And what we found was quite a few key areas. Firstly, we found that a lot of these systems don't even refer, and I'll give you an example. They don't even refer to legal identities in the same way. Because a developer in one solution will go and define one way of doing it, a developer in another solution will define another way. And so the second you try to integrate these platforms, the whole thing just falls flat. And you have to go to physical paper or you have to go to email. And so we found quite a few of these universal standards that are required to make it more efficient, so that a customer who says, do I have to sign up to both Airstocks and Bolero and CargoX and like, how does this work? Can only select the product of their choice, execute trade and settle it in whichever system is out there. The next challenge was that even when you think about bill of lading, there's no electronic bill of lading standard that everyone universally agreed this is the one for containers, a bulk or shipment, etc. So when you think about the platforms that you sign up to, right, because there's no standard and because the local laws don't always have electronic records in a way that you can actually exchange title, what ends up happening is every platform owner have to define what that is themselves, and they bake that into their systems. And so we have two options. Option one is either the entire world adopt one platform for moving documents across, documents of title, or the other option is we democratize it. And so the only mechanism that we know of at the DSI to do the democratization is to say, okay, well, how do we ensure that we have standards so that a fresh graduate in India, for example, can pick up the standards and say, I now know how to contribute. I can see this is what identity is. I can see this is what an e-bill is. And I can see these are some of the terms and definitions required in my system if I wanted to transfer title between different systems. And so while you have infrastructure like EUCP in the LC space, and you have infrastructure like URDTT that's busy being defined, what the DSI itself is solving for is how do I get to a world where I don't have to convince my entire supply chain to join one system? Because we don't believe that will be successful.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic also, World. Wonderful, because it's always a challenge because, as you rightly pointed out, there are different standards. Everybody is not on the same page. I'll give you a very curious example. In India, we always mention like bill of lading is a title to the goods, which we were curious and we found out it is actually the definition under Sale of Goods Act. But an expert in sitting in UK, I mean, I wouldn't name him for obvious reasons, somebody who all know, once said that, this only gives you the right to take the documents, I mean, take the underlying goods, but it really doesn't give you a title to the goods. That being the case, you must be knowing that Sean Edwards, on behalf of ICC, is actually working on whether UK can accept a digitized form of bill of exchange. Many large corporates in India, because of the hassles, attached to a bill of exchange, avoid bill of exchange is all their LC transactions. Now, the other day we had a meeting of the ICC India working group under the aegis of Mr. Imran Khan, who have formed a group, taking people from all the agencies. That's wonderful. You have guys from Indian Banks Association, you have the FEDI head, you have, all powerful State Bank of India. I don't know whether Mr. Venkat is still around. So, there are challenges, and two legal experts who very authoritatively said that lot of amendments, is required to the Indian Contract Act 1872. Despite, uniform rules for demand guarantees, 758 being a wonderful document, there are not too many users because of the complexities of the transaction. So, that's precisely what I am trying to emphasize. that many of the ICC's wonderful initiatives haven't really reached the target audience because, maybe we have not been able to take it to the actual user, or, like this time, since you are contemplating, or, your emphasis is on SMEs or MSMEs as they are called in India. This is more important, like many of them are not very tech savvy. I'm not again casting aspersions any of them, and they don't have the time to devote so much time in technology and, like the kind of money, because one of the reasons I believe the bank payment obligation didn't take off, because nobody knew. The banks thought it was the corporate's idea. I mean, corporate should come and ask the banks. Banks thought, what the heck, if the corporate don't ask for it, why should I go forward and offer them? Now, when you introduce your DTT to the users, to the banks and all others, I mean, like, it will be an onerous task to convince the users and the banks to adopt the new set of rules. And because, like, technology changes before one can say Jack Robinson. So by the time you set one set of standards, Oswald, I do not know. I'm mildly technologically challenged. Whether, like, the blockchain becomes another story because BPO suddenly gets ousted by blockchain and distributed ledger. So, Oswald, I'm very sure ICC and DSI is doing a wonderful job. And I'm only what you call the devil's advocate. The practice is gone from Vatican City since 1998. But allow me to be the devil's advocate, because I'm only asking you to get my doubts clarified and the doubts of the audience clarified. Because, as I said, it's not every day we get a chance to talk to a guy like you. Thanks, Oswald. Over to you again.
I must say, you raised quite a few important points. So I'll take a few. There's quite a few questions there. So the first one is that, and I want to be very, very transparent about this, is one of the first things we're doing is we're making sure we're not actually orientating any of our standards on specific technologies. And the reason that's important is because you are going to live in a world where there's blockchain, non-blockchain, and paper solutions. And so if you're defining standards or rules, etc., and they all need, for example, one of those three to work, my view, and it's a strong design principle from me, is that you will struggle with the change management. There's no way the whole world, you try at a small company or at a company, deploy a product, and even one company with one CEO, when you go to them and say, okay, I want to deploy SAP, it's very difficult to get all of the departments in that one company to stand up at the same time. So there's no way when we come and we approach this problem that we can come in and just say, the whole world is now going to adopt this one technology and here's the standards to make it work. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, and what you say is so, so important. And it's something that a lot of people miss, especially when you don't approach it first from a business point of view. If you approach it from a technology point of view, you miss some of the nuances. And I'll give you a few examples. So firstly, a lot of companies, especially when you have a low margin company, you can't go train up a staff member to learn how to use 7 systems that does the exact same thing and expect them to do that on top of their day job. That's very difficult. Very difficult. 2, most small companies are not going to pay 6 or 7 systems that do the same thing to actually have it. They'll just go to paper. If one of their customers on solution A, the other customers on solution B, etc., they're just going to say, hey, let's use paper. That's fundamentally what will happen. And the final challenge is even for some of the larger organizations. I was talking to a bank yesterday, and they said, it's a really big European bank, and they said, Oswald, the problem we have is you go to a branch and you enable the branch to use this e-platform. Basically, I need to go train someone up in the branch to do that. And if that person goes on leave, or if that person gets a promotion or leaves the company, then there's no one in the branch that know how to use the platform. Then I have to train someone up again, and it stops the whole process. So the reason I highlight all of these things is because it's so important what you say. We have to approach this thinking about, how do people actually trade? How do they actually use the solutions, and how do we approach that? And so if I think about the products that we're developing, and you think a bit about, for example, the electronic bill of lading, instead of ICC sitting somewhere in Singapore and defining this is the bill of lading for the world, it's finding the partners that have actually worked with the carriers who can say, this will work for us. This is it. And this is the thing. I was speaking to one of the large carrier, one of the large shipper alliances the other day, and they said, you know, in the last 20 years, no one's ever really come to us and asked us, well, why isn't this working? How do we actually contribute? And so that's on the change side. Now, you also mentioned the legal side. Now, one of the things I sometimes feel like is that I've actually not taken up a standards project, but I'm doing a legal project because I think I talk to about 100 lawyers every week. Because that is the big issue. So the issue is, firstly, the issue is you have a lot of countries that don't recognize electronic records. The second issue you have is even the countries that do accept it, they don't talk about it in the same way. So the definition for control of the electronic record is not the same. So if I'm the importer and you're the exporter, and our countries use electronic record, have electronic record legislation, but the definitions are different, that's a risk. So there's a lot of work that we need to do there, and that's going to take time. That will take time. And getting model laws like UNCITRAL's model law for electronic transferable records deployed takes also a lot of work, because you can't just go to a country and say, here's the solution. You have to engage locally, understand the local context, understand the local, challenges, understand what the economy is built on, and see how do you actually make the case for change. And that will take time. Now, that to me is the long-term game. How do we accelerate the adoption of UNCITRAL's model law for electronic transferable records? But in the short term, we need to be laser focused on the private law solution. So where regulation doesn't exist yet, private law comes in. And so we all have these different contracts that we've signed to digitize our electronic transferable records today. Some are just terms and conditions, some are called rule books. They have different terminology, but they all do the same thing. They define what the title document is based on the private law contract, and they define the modus of operation. And so this is a key area that ICC is going to step into, to say, on the title itself, what needs to be solved and what is the best solution out there? Is it a document from ICC? Is it that we work with partners like, the shippers and the freight forwarders and see, do they have existing standards? Do they have existing processes that can be modified to solve this, etc.? So there's a lot of different options. And my Northern Star, and again, this is why I'm so proud that my KPI is not the amount of standards I produce, but the solution, is to find whatever ends up being the right place for it that's actually going to lead to adoption. And I think that's the only way you solve it. That's the only way you solve it. Otherwise, I will be producing a document that will be on a website. And to your point, I don't think a lot of people will use unless I do that. I don't know. What do you think?
Oswald, I do not know. I will allude to the if you are a follower of soccer, the goal of the century which Diego Maradona scored against England. Apparently, all the English defenders wanted him to run zigzag, and he ran in a straight line. So he didn't dodge past anyone, since he was simply running and dodged past six guys, because all of them were expecting that he would make a body sword. Now, whatever document you are planning, my humble suggestion would be that if you keep it very simple, which is, understood by both Oswald and Pinaki at two extremes, it will be easier to implement. Look at the UCP. The biggest strength is it has got only 39 articles, prone to 39 from 49, and it's relatively simple to follow. If you ask me the most popular set of rules which ICC have ever produced, two set of rules would be vying for the top spot. One is UCP, the other is Incoterms. Despite all the complexities, you will see that like everybody is talking in terms of UCP. Maybe many people may not be knowing that it is ICC which produced this, but they are familiar with both UCP and Incoterms. As I said, ICC is like, the credibility. Even a couple of days ago, one of the guys asked me a question related to a letter of credit, and then they asked me that what is the ICC opinion then on that? Unless ICC says something, even if thousand Pinakis of the world pronounce that this is the right way to do it, like we do not have the credibility of ICC. So Oswald sir, you are in a unique position. Whatever you say, rest assured that for the next few years, we will be quoting that. Don't you remember what Oswald said in a webinar on 26th of February, which Imran Khan very kindly organized, and like asked Pinaki to spoil the show. So I mean, look at it. I mean, like if you keep it simple, something like International Swap Dealers Association document, which all the derivative dealers use. So like it's very, very important. There is a uniformity. Like you produce a wonderfully worded document which no one understands, and like I follow something which you don't understand. It's like talking Aramaic to Oswald and or some other language which nobody else follows. While there are wonderful initiatives, and ICC, as you rightly pointed out, it's not ICC alone. In fact, Mr. Imran Khan is trying to get everybody aboard. Although it's a wonderful thing he has done by forming the working group where everybody is in. And Oswald, in the coming days, I'm very sure will be more interacting with you, taking your suggestion. This question goes from Imran, that what do you think India should adopt for a faster digitalization here? The fast track digitalization or faster mode of digitalization?
Well, thank you so much, and to kind of close off some of the conversation there too. You are spot on. This is a area that if the solution is complex, if it doesn't cater for the actual business community, it's not going to happen. It's not going to work. And I think all of you come with us on this journey, work with ICC India, and let's make sure that we all work together on these products to make sure that they succeed. Because we're all in the same. This is the first time we're all really orientated towards the exact same objective. Whether you're in banking, shipping, we're all focused on the same thing. So let's work together. I think on the question on how can India participate or how can they accelerate the journey, there's a few things there that I would want to highlight. I think the first is that we need to ensure that where India has done great work is that we actually elevate that and use some of that capability that you have and actually help solve for some of these key challenges. So please do join the ICC India, join the working groups, join the projects, because the more capability we have, the more experience and people we have that look at these challenges and bring their perspectives on what the solutions are going to be, the higher the chance of us succeeding is going to be. So please, this is really a call from my side. There's not just an Oswald that's going to solve this. There's going to be an army of us, and it's people like me and it's people like you looking at the different problems, coming up with solutions, and ICC elevating that onto the global stage. The second thing I would also say is on the regulation side is for us to all work together to see how do we actually approach, for example, the implementation or the adoption of some of UNCITRAL's model law for electronic transferable records. There's a big global community working on this. The UK is also now with the G7 looking at these specific elements too. And so I think what you'll see is more and more and more nations are going to start looking at that. And what I've personally found, my personal experience is that a lot of people look at those, for example, the model laws, and they think, oh, but this won't work. This would not be compatible with our own system. Do pull on ICC and have us help in that process with the United Nations and actually help talk through that and have a look at what are the complications, how can we help? Because at the end of the day, once we solve the regulation side, all of the other challenges we have on the title transfers fall away. and it will have a massive impact on the actual on our digitization success. And then the final thing I would say is that we live in a very big world with lots of companies and lots of different industries. And one of the things you all would have probably have noticed is I mentioned quite a few industries and I mentioned quite a few alliances. And I talk about, like, you know, FIATA is working on standards, DCSA is working on standards, etc. Come to us if you have solved some of the challenges that you believe, based on your engagements with your customers, etc., is something that could become an international standard. And you believe if ICC looked at it and we put it through our engine, could actually get it to a point where it becomes a global norm, please let us know. I don't want to produce the 100 standards for the world, but I do want to find the right people who have the right experience, who've done all the right thinking, and I want to see how do we uplift that. Please, there's over 1 billion people in India. I look at all the great blockchain work that's happening there. I'm sure we will find things that will help us accelerate this journey. Please.
Thank you so much, Oswald. I mean, like, it's absolutely captivating listening to you. I didn't realize that, you know, it's been 1 hour I've been listening to you. It's absolutely fascinating, very engaging, and I'm sure that Mr. Imran Khan would give us more opportunities to listen to you. Instead of me moderating that's wonderful. That's Namaste in India. That's very, very wonderful. And instead of me moderating the questions, I'll request Mr. Imran Khan to pick up the questions and ask on behalf of the audience. I have a little technological problem here because you might see I'm masquerading as my daughter. So it will be wonderful. So it will be wonderful if Mr. Imran Khan takes over. But I would say also, while COVID has been a big menace, but I think it also prepared us for the faster digitization. Suddenly, you know, everybody is talking about digitization of documents instead of the resistance which you had seen even a couple of years ago. So my question would be, ICC gearing up for, you know, like, you never know, when the Spanish flu happened, almost coinciding with the foundation of ICC, and 100 years later, we have another devastating menace. And, you know, like, we have a lot of problems with documents under LC. I'm not dragging you into the local issues, because we have many issues like the IDPMS, EDPMS. We have our own problems. But let me assure you, India has been doing wonderfully well. And as you would know that when it comes to gray cells, the Indians don't lack gray cells. Maybe we are found wanting in other areas. So, Mr. Imran Khan, may I request you to moderate the question and answer session?
Thank you very much, Mr. Pinaki Roy and Oswald, for what I think quite a ground that we've covered over here. Now, Mr. Pinaki Sahab, you left me with something to moderate questions. I think that was an engaged understanding between you and Utpal. Utpal, are you there? Can you pose questions to Oswald? And if Mr. Nageswar is there, would he like to make his observation? Would he like to comment? Would he like to say something, Mr. Nageswar?
So I have sent you one question to start.
Okay, sure. Do you want to read it out, or you sent it to
Yeah,
Oswald?
no, I have sent it to you.
To me?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a question from Vidya Prabhakar. She says that two main hurdles in trade digitization are the requirements of bill of lading endorsement and bill of exchange acceptance in physical form. Majority of the countries follow UK NY law. To get a legal endorsement for electric version of these two documents would probably accelerate digital adoption multifold. Is there some update in this area?
What I'll do is I'll keep it at a high level. Please do add me on LinkedIn so I can keep you updated on that question. So I spend probably at least 2 hours every week, you know, engaging with the UK specifically on trade digitization and some of the regulatory work over there. There's not a lot that I can share, you know, in a forum like this, but what I can tell you is that everyone's very familiar and everyone's very aware of this problem and this challenge. And our Secretary General from ICC UK, Southworth, is actually one of the leaders when it comes to both our digital roadmap that we had, but also in those sessions making sure that we push for the solutions to some of those challenges. So great question, great observation. I wish I could share more, but do know that ICC is pushing very hard on that challenge.
Thank you very much. Well, now, sorry,
Imran, if I may supplement, in fact, the question which the lady has posed, I presume she's from State Bank of India, and the legal head of ICC wing, Mr. Sean Edwards, is working on this digitized bill of exchange. He believes, rightly perhaps, that since most of the laws, bill of exchange laws in communal countries are based on, UK Bill of Exchange Act of 1882. So if the changes are accepted in UK, maybe most of the Commonwealth countries would follow suit. There is a little anachronism because it's in a lighter vein. The NI Act 1881 precedes UK Bill of Exchange Act 1882. Nevertheless, I mean, there is a feeling, and these gentlemen and like their team are working very actively on this. I mean, I would request Vidya if she can always send a query to Sean Edwards. I'm very sure he would be happy to answer her questions. Oswald, you might agree with me. I mean, they're very prompt in responding to all these queries. Thanks, Imran sir. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Now, I would request, I think, our colleague from the banking, ICC India Working Group on Banking and Finance, Mr. Ganesh Vishwanathan. Utpal, can you just unmute him? He wanted to ask a question. It will be better if he just directly communicates. Thanks. Mr. Vishwanathan, Ganesh sir, can you hear us?
Ganesh sir, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there.
Yeah, please go ahead and ask your question. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, Oswald, I'm coming back to my favorite subject, right? ICC is looked at as a policy maker, as a rule maker, being a self-regulating organization. That is how we in the industry look up at ICC. Now, my question is, that being so, how are ICC looking at initiatives under DSI on preventing financial crimes? Will we introduce standards and rules which will ring fence trade flow documentation, which is in the digitized format against financial crime activity? Because that industry, again, is a multi-trillion-dollar industry and far ahead in adoption of technological initiatives than what we are up against. So what is your thought on that? What is it that ICC is proposing to do under DSI on this front? Thank you.
Thank you. So in short, there's over 60 different document types in the trade process, and some of them are more higher risk prone when it actually comes to, the ability to leverage them for ill gains, if you will. So one of the things that we have done at the DSI is make sure that we become laser focused on some of the documentary types, and like, for example, invoicing, to see, okay, well, what is it? How do we ensure that we accelerate the production of standards? And how do we ensure that we accelerate the ability for organizations to be able to validate and verify cross-country borders, leveraging the standards for those document types? The second thing I would also highlight there is that one of the things that you would see is that in various different countries, and I see DLT Ledgers, I think, is also online, various different great companies have actually started the process of saying, how do they solve this in different jurisdictions? I think DLT Ledgers in Singapore is a company that started to look into that, for example, in the Singapore space. And so one of the key things that we will do at the DSI is actually engage with companies like that who are specifically looking at how do we actually produce value in this space by reducing risk, and seeing, well, what can we pick up from what they've done that ultimately either can become a standard, can become a rule, etc. Now, I want to make it clear, even where we find some really good practices, it's still taking it through the ICC machine and the ICC engine to ensure that we can have a holistic engagement approach, ensure that everyone can view what we've actually done before we produce something that either becomes a standard or a rule at the end of the day. And closing statement, what I would say though is that even though fraud is a major challenge, my primary objective for this year is specifically orientated towards two core areas. One is the foundational information types, and some of them will help us in some of the fraud cases that we've seen. How do we ensure that from a legal entity identification system perspective, we can all ensure that we know which companies we're referring to in the various different systems? And that's a complicated challenge that I can probably spend a half an hour on, but there's a few great standards in there that we will be releasing and advocating for this year that will help ensure that at least between the systems, we know we're talking about the same people. The second thing that we're also releasing this year, and this is in partnership with others, is standards for certain title documents, so that we can ensure that the information on those title documents and the processes governing the preparation and the issuance of those documents are consistent and the same. And so this is, to me, where it then becomes important for the industry, for fintechs and banks, etc., all to leverage these standards and actually help solve for some of those use cases.
Okay, that brings me to another corollary question. Digitization initiatives, Oswald, cost tons of money, right? Lots of cash has already been burned by fintech companies and technology intermediaries globally in developing their own versions of digitized products. But unfortunately, each one of them are working in silos in digital islands or technology islands. Now, my question to you is, that being so, how is ICC DSI proposing to bring them together and persuade them to join this DSI initiative? If I am that technology firm, what is in it for me?
I love the question. I really do, and thank you so much for asking it. There's three things I want to touch on there. The first is, this is exactly the feedback I also got in December. I brought in, I think it was about 36 different platforms into a meeting to talk about standards, and the majority of them gave that feedback, said, look, we've already built systems, we already have our own definitions in these systems, it's going to cost a lot of money if we had to adopt something. So that is a recognition that I think we should all make, and that's on the platform side. Now, I think it's also important to recognize that you both have the fintechs that are enabling trade digitization, and we need to, and there's a need there to ensure how do you support the adoption of standards. But in addition to that, especially because we're solving for people who either use blockchain platforms, non-blockchain platforms, or paper platforms, the same standards, for example, can be adopted by importers and exporters into their own sales and sales operations platforms, to ensure that if you go from your sales operation platform into your electronic documentation platform, you don't then again need to do an actual translation. So it's quite a large audience of people that might potentially be impacted by this. So there's a few things there. So the first thing is, when we have a look at how do we approach the standards in a way that it doesn't disrupt the industry, let's think about identity first. If you think about Glyph, it's a global standard that's been created by the G20. It already has 1.8 million legal entities listed in it. And so it's leveraging existing infrastructure so that the amount of change going from where they are today to where they need to go isn't that big. The same as when you look at, for example, the work that DCSA has done, the Digital Container Shipping Alliance. It's not reinventing the wheel, but rather just taking that next step into the digitization landscape. So ensuring that the changes become smaller. But the final thing I will say is, when you think about the market, a lot of the, and this is what my message is to the market, especially the technology companies, is we're all busy competing within a 0.1% e-bill adoption market. And the second we adopt the standards, and the second we have interoperability, we will see the volumes of trade digitization increasing, the amount of customers they have. The whole retail industry is still left untapped. The amount of customers that will then start going into the platforms will also increase. So when I speak to some of the CEOs of the platforms, the first question I ask them is, do you realize that by actually solving interoperability, you're going to end up probably increasing your company's valuation 100-fold? and they all agree. So I think this is the benefit we have. The benefit we have is there's a lot of existing infrastructure that we can leverage so we don't rock the market too much. That existing infrastructure in most cases still reflect the physical world a little bit. Yes, some people are going and trying to completely, eliminate stuff like bills of lading, and you'll see stuff like that. But most of the standards that we're advocating for is the digital representation of what's happening in the physical landscape, at least at a minimum. And then finally, there's a massive business case for these technology companies to transition from the volume they have today to a world where their customer base fundamentally just increases 100, 1,000-fold. What do you think?
I'm keeping my
Also,
fingers crossed.
yeah, thanks, Ganesh. One suggestion for Mr. Imran I just wonder whether the next working group meeting, whether we can have Mr. Oswald subject to his availability as a special invitee instead of writing as rapporteur. We can have him and have his views there and then sum it up as Oswald has said so. I mean, it's already a suggestion. But since he's not very far, it's only 2.5 hours ahead of us. And what Mr. Imran might have realized that in fact I'm sitting closer to Oswald than guys in Bombay or Delhi. I'm in Calcutta, which is actually closer to Singapore. I was just wondering, whether we can have him invited in the next working group meeting, where we'll have the benefit of Oscar's knowledge and what's actually happening all around instead of getting the questions and asking him later. And once again, I have no question to ask. If anybody else, I think Mr. Prashant Mittal has been sending messages that he wants to ask a question. I don't know whether he's still around. And Mr. Ganesh, as usual, asks very incisive questions. It's always a learning for us. And yes, sir. Please, Imran sir, over to you.
Yeah, there is a question from Vidya. She says, what is the end use of digitalization standard initiative? How is it envisaged? Would it be standardization of documents to enable OCR output to be more accurate, or would it enable direct data transfer also? What kind of documents or areas are we covering in phase one? Wow.
Imran Khan sir, just think of the one question from the State Bank of India crowd. What will happen when you actually go and implement those in State Bank of India? So I mean, lots of questions. Thanks, Vidya, for asking this question. Oswald, over to you.
So both. And the reason I say this, and it's very important, is because we're technology agnostic, my focus is the data that you get off the e-bill in a PDF format, or is it being OCR'd off the PDF? Is someone uploading the PDF and then typing in a form with all of the information or having it OCR'd? Or is someone actually producing a token with all of that data while the physical document also exists potentially from the actual carrier? And so for me, the standard in this year for phase one is what is the minimum data requirements, as an example, on a e-bill of lading for container standard. What are the fields? What are optional? What is mandatory? And from a process perspective, how do we ensure that the drafting and issuance process was the same? That's an example of one. And it's very similar when you go to some of the other use cases too. What's the data? What data is mandatory? What is the process in which that data was potentially created and maintained? And the reason, again, is if we do this in a way where it only caters for one environment versus the other, we won't be successful. Now, you're going to have change management problems potentially. So if a platform decides, okay, they don't actually want the PDF, they want to produce a token and just leverage the data off the token, when they get to customs, they would still, for example, need to find a way to convert that into a PDF format. But this is an area where industry and the creativity in industry will solve for it. So I hope that answers the question, but that's how we view it. And the kinds of documents for me is, and again, like reach out on LinkedIn if this doesn't align to your views. I asked that 100 different companies, what are the first documentation that we need to solve for? And we basically got 4 types back. The first one was solve for the variances in electronic bill of lading. Give us a standard. What's the data? What is the processes? How do we deal with that? 2 was warehouse receipts, the same questions. What's the data? What's the processes, etc. The third one was invoicing. And this also comes back to the fraud challenge. Like, give us a standard. There's different standards out there, but how do we deal with this? Which one do we pick? And the final one, which is going to be the most difficult one for us to solve, and I'm not even sure if you can solve it, but is how do we standardize on the purchase order process? So going from PO to invoice and the title documentation in between.
So thank you so much, Oswald. I had one question, and I'm just want to, just taking the privilege of being the host here. Is do you have what been your recent success, and have you what's been your experience? And very briefly, if you want to just share, because of course we do have in the room, I'm seeing not only just bankers, we have some some of our members who come from the corporate. So what's been your experience, just very briefly, and if you have had any success in terms of convincing them or rather converting them to adopt standard digitization. Thanks.
There's a few, and so I'll try to keep it short, just because I know the time is a challenge. To me, success equals anything that shortens the time frame between where we are today and mass adoption. So anything that we've seen, that is to me success. So here's a few examples. The first thing that I found when I joined the DSI was the great news that ICC doesn't have to start from zero. It's not that we now have to go and start from zero and start an 18-month project to create the standards for a lot of these different elements. So again, if you come back to those 60 different document types that I mentioned a little bit earlier, the vast majority of those either had standards that were underutilized, that people just didn't know, where I went to either a fintech or I went to a sales operations team and I asked them, why aren't you using it? And they went, I didn't know it existed. The second thing that we also found was where there were gaps, different industries were actually solving it, people just didn't know. So I'll give you an example on warehouse receipts. There were 3 different consortia trying to solve the exact same thing. And by actually talking to people and saying, whoa, let's stop just reinventing the wheel. Guess what? We can all come together and solve this once. Then our chances of adoption also increases. And so that to me was another win. Again, just finding great people already solving these challenges where we can actually bring people together. And the final thing that I'll just mention 3, but the final thing to me, and I can probably end up talking for an hour on this, is the fact that there was a true recognition. Think about it. 3 years ago, everyone was producing their own blockchain platform thinking they're going to win. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we all thought that it's just going to be 2 platforms that ultimately own the whole market. That's, if you asked us 10 years ago, that's would have been what people would have thought. So the win to me is that when I went to importers and exporters and shippers and bankers and the fintechs themselves, we all had the recognition that there won't be one platform. We all need to work together, and that at the end of this journey, there will be new business models, new innovation that will make it worth it. And so from a change perspective, having that energy really, to me, is a win.
Thank you so much. I think we do have a time for one quick question from Mr. Ashwani Sindwani. He has raised his hand. Mr. Sindwani, do you want to go ahead, please?
Sure. Thanks, Imran. First of all, thanks ICC India and ICC International for organizing this thing. It's really quite engaging discussion, and thanks to our, we call him Dada. So he claims he's spoil sport. He's not a spoil sport. This time he was a showstopper, and I must say that Oswald, you had a tough competition, and I acknowledge that both of you really did very well. So I'm really thankful to you for that. And a few things also which you mentioned in your discussion, I would like to just pick up on that and take your views. One point, you said it very right, that there are so many digital silos currently operating. There are pockets of excellence. And what you are looking as DSI is to bridge those digital silos. That I don't think anybody could have put it in a better words, that particular thing. And then the second point where I think India can really do some good work is that you mentioned that you would like to identify good works done, identify and elevate and present those as an example. On that, I would like to share with you, India today, if I can say, our entire intra-region trade is digitized. We have got e-invoicing, we have got e-transport documents, everything is digitized, all trade within the country. And India, as you know, is not lesser than a continent. It is a much bigger place, and across all the different states, union territories, entire trade is digitized. Obviously, there are standards which have already been devised, standardized, and working well. Maybe something like that can be looked at. If that is something can be adopted and can be universalized, can be internationalized, that can be one thing to look at. And I would see, I'm not sure how we can coordinate on that. Maybe ICC India can play a role. We'd be happy to work together on this as an industry. I'm sure there will be many people part of this discussion also who have worked on those things. And second, I'm coming to again working from my little knowledge I have got on the trade. You mentioned about e-bill of lading and all these documents. You need to identify the critical elements, components, or the data points which need to be taken into consideration to make that universally acceptable. And I can understand that each country will have their own data set. One may ask for 1 to 10, the other person may say 1 to 5, and third person may say ABC or anything. And over there, what comes to my mind is that for trade, international trade, we have got a system which is harmonized system of international trade. Where they have got the numbers for each commodity. The first 6 digits are internationally harmonized. Can we think of something similar for these data points, for e-bill of lading kind of thing? We can look at the data points and then look at the critical which are common. And those can be harmonized across the globe. And these are the standard. After that, each country can build on, add on to their own thing, depending to their requirement or their need or their local necessities, whatever it is. These were some of the things which were coming to my mind, and I thought I would share with you, and would be happy to have your views and how we can work, take it forward going. And because India has got a lot of experience and some groundwork, decent groundwork has already happened over here.
Thank you so much. And this is where I'm really excited of working closely with Imran, because India has dealt with complexities that other countries haven't. And it's the complexities you actually need to deal with to make this work. So please, everyone, work with Mr. Imran, and let's make sure that we can find those golden nuggets. It helps my job. Think about it. I want to accelerate it. And so the more great things we find that we can elevate, the less time we have to spend redefining it. And the final point I want to make on what was just said is so true. We need to harmonize these elements internationally, but at the same time, there's standards like the DID specification for identity, which actually enables India to have identity standards, Singapore to have one, South Africa to have one, and then instead of settling on the standard itself, producing a protocol to ensure, okay, if I want to check this identity, it's an Indian one, it will go to India. It's a South African one, it will go to South Africa. And these are also the type of tools that we have at our disposal that will truly help us, again, to some of the earlier points. The more we do things where there's less change for the ecosystem, the more successful we'll be in the adoption. No, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. I think just one last question. I think I'm getting lots of WhatsApp messages, but nevertheless, just is that is there any way to have interoperability between the new blockchain system and the old non-blockchain based system? Do you have anything that?
Yes. And there's quite a few solutions that already partner. I'll give you an example. S-Stocks, for example, S-Stocks, Alexander Galandras from S-Stocks have integrated with MineHub, a non-blockchain and a blockchain-based platform. So my view is the technology is not the challenge. We'll be able to work through that and fix that relatively quickly. It's the actual trade documentation standards, it's the legal work. That's really where the complexity will be.
Yeah, thank you so much. I believe if Mr. Pinaki, do you have anything to say, Mr. Pinaki? Otherwise, we can conclude.
No, it's wonderful. Like it has been very enriching, very engaging. And the questions also asked by Mr. Sindhavani, who also incidentally He's the chief executive of FEDI in India, one of the policy makers. So whenever he speaks, we listen carefully and we also try to implement. It's wonderful talking to you, Oswald. I have greatly enriched, and I'll request Mr. Imran to get you back as a speaker. And someday when all this get over, I'm very sure we'll sit over a cup of coffee and, with warm exchange of pleasantries. So I'll request Mr. Imran Khan to close such a wonderful session. And namaste once again to Oswald and all the participants. Thanks, Mr. Imran.
Thank you, Pinaki sir. Oswald, I would just like to add to what Mr. Pinaki said that Mr. Simwani is also on our working group. So we do have a very diverse group. We are looking to expand that further and hope to do something more substantive in future. Anyway, so let me just officially close this. I believe that every opportunity, every crisis presents an opportunity, and this in this pandemic, digitalization is one such opportunity. With the emergence of coronavirus, there has been a widespread in the pace of digitalization across the globe, and we need to continue and rapidly build on this momentum going ahead. The future of trade is going to be digital, and so we need to gear up and update our systems and make them fit for the 21st century. On behalf of ICC India, I wish to thank Mr. Oswald Kuyler, Mr. Nageswar, Mr. Pinaki Roy for this very informative discussion. I also wish to thank all the participants for their enthusiastic involvement in today's proceeding. I hope you all found it useful, and we hope to see more of Oswald engaging with the Indian community. And that's it from
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.